Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our annual Academies webinar. My name is Emma Swann. I am a partner and head of our Academies team. So the plan this morning is we're going to be focusing on some of the key issues that have arisen for schools over the past year. I will be taking a look at some strategies for responding to serious behavioural incidents. I'm very pleased to be joined by three of my colleagues. Jonathan Edwards is a partner and head of insurance and risk investigation. He will talk to you about conducting risk assessments. Coral Pupil, who is a solicitor in our education team, will look at how you should respond to allegations of abuse, particularly in light of Everyone's Invited. Steve Murray, who is a partner in our dispute resolution team, will then talk to you about protecting your school's reputation. And last, but by no means least, I'm delighted to welcome Hannah Woodhouse, who is Regional School Commissioner for the Southwest. She will be explaining her role as an RSC and will talk to you about the government's plans for academies and mapped expansions. If anyone has any questions, please do include them in the chat box, and we will endeavour to answer them at the end of this session. So, over the past year, sorry, Tom, could you move on to the first slide, please? Thank you. Over the past year, and I think it's probably fair to say in particular since the start of this term, we've seen a significant increase in the number of schools seeking advice about serious incidents. It certainly appears that the return to school after lockdown has led to an escalation and perhaps unaddressed issues coming to the fore. So at this time, it's particularly important that your academy has robust behaviour and exclusions policies in place. The applicable advice is the Dfes guidance on behaviour and discipline in schools. Now, the starting position here is that an academy must ensure that it has a written policy in place to promote good behaviour, and you should also have an effective anti-bullying strategy. The information about your behaviour policy must be made available to any parents on request. Quite surprisingly, there's no requirement to publish this policy online, but we would certainly recommend that it's good practice to do so. To manage poor behaviour, we tend now to recommend to schools that you should ensure that you have a robust and clear behaviour policy, and usually a separate exclusions policy. Now, the reason for this is because we see time and time again difficulties when schools create a combined policy. And we often find that the school's policy on exclusions is not dealt with in sufficient detail. So staff are not fully aware of the process, and mistakes can inevitably be made if the correct procedure is not followed. Tom, could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, your school's behaviour policy should, obviously as a starting point, promote good behaviour and clearly set out any disciplinary sanctions. As you would expect, this may be, say, a verbal reprimand, detention, things like litter picking, letters home to parents. Now, in order to be effective, the behaviour policy needs to be well understood by all staff at your school and must also be consistently applied so that you can prevent challenges of discrimination. Teachers will have the power to discipline pupils who break the school rules. Now, this may be either whilst the pupil is in school, on educational visits, and outside school as well, particularly where there could be an adverse impact on your school's reputation. I would always suggest that this is clearly set out, however, in your policy, which will make it easier if you are implementing an exclusion or any other sanction, that it has been clearly referenced. Now, any sanctions that are introduced must, of course, be proportionate, so they should take into account a pupil's age and any special educational needs. And alongside this, I would suggest that you also have policies on searching, screening and confiscation and the reasonable use of force. Tom, could you move to the next slide, please? Now, as I mentioned, I would suggest that you have a separate exclusions policy in place, or at the very least, a detailed exclusions policy set out within your behaviour policy that will help to ensure that your staff and governors are clear on the process to follow when considering exclusions. Now, your exclusions policy should clearly set out the types of incident for which a pupil may be excluded. Here, I would always suggest you go beyond, say, acts of violence. Think about intimidation, threats, and of course, behaviour outside of your school. It's important to remember that it's only the head who has authority to exclude a pupil. The exclusion must be on disciplinary grounds, and that could only relate to the pupil, unfortunately not their parents. When making a decision to exclude a pupil, the head needs to ensure the decision is made in line with the principles of administrative law. So this means the decision must be lawful, rational, reasonable, fair, and proportionate. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, you need to carry out a thorough investigation. The pupil should have the opportunity to put their case. You should provide reasons for your decision, and you should follow the procedures that are set out within your own policy and in the Dfes guidance on exclusions. Now, a pupil can be excluded for either a fixed period or permanently. One issue that we do see is parents complaining that they basically want proof. They want proof that their child did it, particularly if there's an ongoing criminal investigation. Now, what it's important for you to note as a school is that the head teacher only needs to apply the civil standard of proof. So this is that on the balance of probabilities, it's more likely than not that a fact is true. So this is different, of course, than the criminal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. You should also be aware that you do not need to await the outcome of a court decision before taking a decision to exclude. Next slide, please. Now, factors to be considered. Well, the head teacher should consider any contributing factors before reaching a decision to exclude. So here I'm thinking about whether the pupil perhaps has any mental health issues, if they've been subject to bullying themselves. Now would also be an appropriate time to conduct an assessment of whether the right provision is in place to support any special needs that the pupil may have. As a default position, you need to be aware, of course, that within the guidance, it does state that as far as possible, you should avoid excluding a child who has an education and healthcare plan in place. This doesn't mean, of course, that you cannot do so, but what I would say when we see these cases, it will be very important for you to demonstrate that all steps, you need to go back and basically demonstrate all the steps your school has taken to support that pupil with special needs to improve their behaviour. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, as I mentioned, an exclusion can be for a fixed period or it may be permanent. If you're excluding a pupil for a fixed period, you should ensure they're not excluded for more than the 45 school days in an academic year. It's also been made very clear now within the guidance that fixed periods of exclusion can never be converted into a permanent exclusion. What you can do, however, in exceptional cases, and this is usually where we find further evidence perhaps has come to light, a permanent exclusion can be issued to begin immediately after the end of the fixed period. Just so that you're aware, there is, as you will probably expect, a higher hurdle for permanent exclusions. So any decision to exclude a pupil permanently should only be taken in response to a serious breach or persistent breaches of your school's behaviour policy. And this again brings us back to the importance of having the behaviour policy, everything clearly set out and defined within it. Also, where allowing a pupil to remain in your school would seriously harm the education or welfare of the pupil or others in the school. Tom, can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, in terms of notification, once a head has decided that the exclusion of a pupil is a reasonable sanction, they should, without delay, notify parents in writing of the period of exclusion and the reasons. In addition, the head should also notify the school's governing board and local authority if it's a permanent exclusion, if the pupil has been excluded for more than 5 school days in a term, or if the exclusion would result in the pupil missing an examination. Furthermore, and this is basically once each term, the head should also ensure that the governing body and local authority are notified of any other exclusions. Tom, could you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, in terms of appeals, your exclusions policy should clearly set out how parents have the right to make an appeal to your governing board. Now, for all permanent exclusions, the governing board should then consider within 15 school days whether a pupil should be reinstated. If the governing board decides not to reinstate a pupil, parents can then request an independent review panel considers this decision. Now, a review panel can decide essentially to uphold the governing board's decision, recommend that the board's decision, recommend that the board reconsiders reinstatement, or it can quash the decision and direct that the governing board reconsiders reinstatement. Now, the panel can only actually quash a decision if it considers that it was flawed when considered in light of the principles that are applicable for judicial review. So what does this actually mean? Well, the panel needs to consider a number of tests. Firstly, illegality. Was the decision outside the scope of the board's powers? Irrationality. Was the decision so unreasonable that no reasonable person could come to that decision? And also procedural impropriety. Now, this is where we're talking about not a minor breach of procedure, but something more substantive. So perhaps a failure to give reasons. Now, this is actually where we see most decisions being successfully challenged. And this is where it brings us back to the importance of the governing board getting their exclusions letter right. So it can be upheld, it can be clearly seen that the governing board considered every aspect and went through everything that they needed to and set out clearly the reasons for their decision. Could you now move on to the next slide, please, Tom? Now, one point that I will certainly mention at the moment, it's always a good idea, and this relates not just to behaviour and exclusions policies, but indeed any others. Always double check if the DfE has issued special provisions relating to COVID. So as things stand, temporary changes have been made to permanent exclusions due to COVID that will apply until the 24th of March 2022. Now, what this means basically is that it allows the use of remote access technology for meetings of governing boards and independent review panels if it's not reasonably practical for the meetings to take place in person within the usual timescales. I would suggest that it would be that you should include that within an addendum to your exclusions policy. I think it will be interesting to see if this is actually continued, hopefully in a post-COVID period, because certainly in the discussions that we've seen, many schools are finding it useful that they can actually engage in this way and hold these meetings remotely. So I guess we'll wait to see if we may well find it, and it wouldn't surprise me if we find that this can actually be continued into the future. Tom, if you can move on, please, to the next slide. So looking at managed moves, now this may be an alternative option which can be considered by schools as a response to behavioural issues. Now, the head would need to be satisfied that all reasonable steps have been taken to attempt to resolve the pupil's misbehaviour, and it is only if parents agree that a managed move is appropriate that the school can seek to arrange it. Now, a managed move cannot be used as a backdoor to permanent exclusion. So if you think that's more appropriate, then that is the process that you need to go down. What usually happens with a managed move is that during perhaps the 6th week, certainly no later than after 12 weeks, a review meeting should take place, and a decision will then be made as to whether the pupil can transfer permanently to the new school. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, a further option for schools to consider, and this of course has been in the news of late, is mandatory off-site schooling. The starting point is the Education Act 2002. This is applicable to maintained schools, and it essentially grants governing bodies the power to direct a pupil off-site for education to improve their behaviour. This action can be taken without parental consent. There are also regulations in place that say that the placement must be kept under review. Now, the key point here for you is this legislation does not apply to academies. However, my view is, and I've advised on this point over many years, is that academies can still arrange off-site provision to improve behaviour under your general powers that are set out in your Articles of Association. Now, you may also be aware there's been a very interesting recent decision in the case of R against Newark, Church of England Primary School. This case involved a young child, very young child in fact, who was accused of peer-on-peer sexual abuse. Now here it was decided by the High Court that a school can mandate off-site education for the purpose of safeguarding separation. Now this case, unfortunately, it wasn't about an academy, but the general consensus amongst education lawyers is that the same principles should apply here. So essentially, the decision was based around schools' duties to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. Now, academies, of course, have the same obligations as maintained schools to comply with keeping children safe in education. Next slide, please. Now, we've already found that a number of schools have sought advice on this and are potentially seeking to rely on this decision. What I would say to you, however, is that as mandatory off-site schooling is imposed without the consent of parents, there is, of course, inevitably going to be a greater risk of challenge. So, but to protect your school, I would recommend that you provide parents with very clear information about the alternative placement, and also that you include that it will be regularly reviewed to ensure that it continues to be a suitable placement. Now, looking at any further action points, what I would say to you, just in summary, is, of course, as we've mentioned, your school's behaviour policy and exclusions policy should either be kept separate or should be sufficiently detailed, clear, and your staff should be receive regular training. You should also maintain a consistent approach to pupil discipline and consider and document all the options that have been considered, whether this be an exclusion, managed move off-site, or mandatory off-site schooling. Now that concludes my slides for today. So I would like to now hand over to Jonathan Edwards.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies if you pick up any background noise. I seem to have found myself in the middle of a construction site. So there's a lot of noise going on around me. And unfortunately, the workers are actually working rather than being on one of their regular tea breaks. So apologies for that. Tom, shall we go to the first slide? Okay. I know it's stating the obvious, but it's important that it's made clear by way of background that children commit very serious criminal offences which can cause significant harm and damage to members of staff or another pupil, or indeed pupil's family and the wider community. Challenging behaviours are often foreseeable, and the key to it is recognising the early warning signs. Now, recently I became aware of a situation involving a pupil who was the subject of very significant abuse, verbal abuse at her school, which also extended to her family. Now, this group set up a social media, set up a group on a social media site, which they used for taking forward the verbal abuse. And unfortunately, the school didn't appear to be aware of the situation at all. And it took the parents who had noticed significant changes in their daughter's behaviour to bring it to the school's attention, and then action was taken. But the situation by this stage, of course, had escalated somewhat. So I think also it's important to realise that many children who are involved in this sort of behaviour often have complex needs and may well have experienced several traumas in their own life. There's a lot of background that's probably going on behind the scenes, and it's for this reason that high quality support and training, as Emma's already mentioned, is required to manage these difficult situations. Next slide, please, Tom. What is paramount is that children's safety and welfare is a priority, and all children in the school's care must be kept safe from harm. And this is an essential part of the overall management of risk. Next slide, Tom. So who's responsible for health and safety? Well, the agenda is set by the governing body, but implemented on a day-to-day basis by the head teacher and his or her management team. And it's their responsibility to ensure that the health and safety policy is followed and there are effective arrangements in place for managing health and safety. And this is required by Section 2, subsection 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which you'll hear more about shortly, which makes it clear that schools must have an effective health and safety policy in place. Risk assessments are essential, but it's not only the doing of the risk assessment, it's the communicating of the risks that have been identified and the control measures that have been put in place to deal with those risks, either by way of elimination or simply a reduction. A risk assessment is absolutely of no value whatsoever unless its contents are properly communicated to people who are affected by those risks. So there must be effective communication. Staff, of course, must understand their responsibilities and how to access the necessary support that they may require. For instance, liaising with the designating safeguarding lead. Again, going back to Emma's point, staff must be properly trained to identify the signs and how to respond to each situation, which of course may be very different in each particular case. Arrangements must be in place for reporting, recording, and investigating incidents, and no distinction should be made between verbal abuse or physical abuse. They both have the capacity to cause considerable harm if not dealt with properly. And of course, there must be regular monitoring. Next slide, please, Tom. So, as promised, here's a little more on the Health and Safety at Work Act, which really sets out the school's duty, not only to its staff, but also to its pupils. Section 2 makes it very clear that the school should ensure, so far as it is reasonably practicable, health, safety, and welfare of staff. And this includes the provision of Section 2, Section 2, subsection 2, subsection C, the provision of information, instruction, training, and Section 2, subsection E, the provision of a working environment without risk to health. Now, once the Health and Safety Executive have established that a risk has arisen, then by virtue of Section 40 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, the burden of proof transfers from the Health and Safety Executive to the school, and it is incumbent on the school to demonstrate that it took all reasonably practicable steps to address the risk. And this is a very heavy burden to overcome, and it explains why in over 90% of cases prosecutions are successfully brought. Section 3 sets out a similar duty, but to third parties, which obviously would include pupils at the school. Section 7 is the duty on your staff to take care not only of their own safety, but the safety of others who may be affected by the work that they're actually doing or don't do. And they have a duty to cooperate with the school on health and safety matters. Section 37 is aimed at senior managers, senior members of staff who have responsibility for health and safety, who become aware of bad practice, but don't do anything about it. They either consent to, or indeed turn a blind eye, which results in an offence being committed. Now, the Health and Safety Executive's enforcement policy statement is clear that when an investigation is carried out, the investigating officer will not only look at the school's potential culpability in an offence, they will also look for individual culpability. And if they believe there is sufficient evidence, and if it is in the public interest, these are two tests that need to be overcome. But if there is sufficient evidence, a prosecution will be made against the individual. Next slide, please, Tom. So the duty to risk assess, as you may well know, arises under Regulation 3 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs to identify, eliminate, and reduce risk where it is possible. It must be carried out by a competent person, and competent means someone with the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience who has gone through appropriate training. Next slide, Tom. Where pupils, there will be occasions when a pupil behaviour risk assessment is required, and these are usually in circumstances where a pupil's behaviour poses an ongoing risk to the two members of the school community, and where the school have endeavoured to apply the behaviour policy, but it hasn't actually had any effect. And there may be sort of triggering events, such as threatening behaviour. So where a pupil is known to have threatened another pupil or a member of staff, or perhaps in a more extreme case, has come into school with a weapon or is talking about bringing in a weapon, that would be sort of undisputed cause for taking action and implementing a proper risk assessment around that pupil. It's important, obviously, to appreciate that one size doesn't fit all and must be tailored to the particular school circumstances and to individual pupils. Next slide, please, Tom. So the person actually carrying out the risk assessment must be aware of the regulatory framework and the school's policies in order to be able to do their task properly. It's important, obviously, that the person consults with staff who have particular knowledge through providing education for the pupil concerned. And although it's not a requirement, it's often good practice to liaise with parents, which could be helpful to formulating successful strategies for dealing with the behaviour. And of course, it may be necessary to liaise with external agencies such as educational psychologists, social services, mental health, etc. Next slide, please, Tom. So the health and safety executive carried out some research which made it very clear that teaching and educational professionals have a higher than average rate of violence at work. So with that in mind, the assessment should evaluate the risk of violence and assault on staff and pupils, the risk of stress arising from working in fear of violence, how those risks can be eliminated, but if they can't be eliminated, consider changes in working practices and the introduction of protective and supportive measures. Violence and stress caused by working at school, where the fear of violence exists, must be properly controlled. So again, share information, implement the control measures that have been identified, and use sanctions appropriately as needs be. And above all, remember that pupils and staff are at risk if the school fail to risk assess and implement the control measures. Next slide, please, Tom. So what next? Well, develop the behaviour management plan, but keep it under regular review. Circumstances change regularly. Consider, as I mentioned before, involving parents in deciding how best to manage the bad behaviour, but make sure you implement continuous training and education. Again, this was something that Emma brought out, and identify the early warning signs. And those early warning signs could be a pupil who is frequently missing from school, a pupil who it's known has challenging family circumstances, a pupil who is known to drink or maybe to use drugs. So by identifying those early warning signs and staff being able to do that, you may well be able to mitigate the potential damage that is likely to arise should it go untapped. And the NSPCC website contains some very helpful guidance about that. All accidents, incidents, and injuries should be reported, irrespective of whether it's verbal or physical, and no matter how trivial. and record, again, I think Emma alluded to this, all concerns, discussions and decisions, so that there is a clear audit trail of all the matters that came under consideration, should that be required. Next slide, please, Tom. Enforcement. The schools, obviously, schools sector in particular has been under fairly relentless spot checks by the Health and Safety Executive, mainly in relation to COVID compliance. But the one thing I do want to say is that an inspector may come onto the school's premises for one purpose, maybe COVID. But if that inspector then finds evidence of other bad practices taking place at the school, they will act on that. So you need to make sure that you stay on top of all your sort of health and safety compliance on a very regular basis, because you never know when the inspector may appear. And a really good example of this was the case of Harlow District Council and G4S, and it related to Legionella. And an employee of G4S sustained Legionella, and the health and safety inspector went round to his work premises at G4S to see whether there was any connection between the workplace and the onset of Legionella. They weren't able to find any connection, but they did find evidence of very poor safety practices, and decided they had no option but to prosecute, and G4S were fined. And remember, there was no actual injury. It was simply they saw the risk of injury arising from the implementation of poor safety management system, and G4S were fined £1.8 million. So very significant. The health and safety executive will also consider, where they do find evidence of bad practice, improvement notices and prohibition notices. I won't go into those in any detail. What I would say is that if the school were to receive such a notice, it should seriously consider grounds for appeal. And the reason I say that is because, unchallenged, the notice is a permanent stay on the school's public criminal record. It will be there and it will remain there. If the appeal is successful, then obviously it will be removed. So consider very carefully whether there are grounds, and if there are, make sure they are taken forward, because it can seriously affect the reputation of the school. And obviously prosecutions against both a school or an individual will be considered where the circumstances dictate. And as you may have seen, fines these days are very significant indeed. And the fine will depend really on the degree of culpability that is found and the risk of harm that arose. And in the worst cases, insofar as individuals are concerned, the imposition of prison sentences is becoming more prevalent. 2 years ago, the number of prison sentences that were imposed as a whole of all sentences was 10%. In the last 12 months, 22% of all sentences imposed were custodial. There is more and more attention being paid to individual culpability. So something really to be very aware of. So with that bombshell, I will hand over to Coral, who will be looking at managing abuse.
Thanks, Jonathan. Morning, everyone. So as Jonathan says, I'll be looking at managing allegations of abuse, particularly in light of the Everyone's Invited website. Next slide, please, Tom. So what is Everyone's Invited? Everyone's Invited is a website that was set up in 2020 as a place where victims, mostly in schools, are encouraged to record their experiences of sexual assault and abuse anonymously. It features accounts from university-age students to pupils as young as 9, with around 3,000 educational institutions having been named on the website. The website also allows victims to directly report crimes to the Metropolitan Police. The reports on Everyone's Invited range from reports of young people being drugged and raped at parties, to explicit images being shared around without consent, both on and off educational premises. Soma Sara, the founder of Everyone's Invited, has said that the website shows that a rape culture is endemic within the education system. We have certainly recently seen an increase in schools contacting us seeking advice in terms of how to manage allegations of abuse in school. And those range from allegations of abuse against children, against staff, and both current and historic allegations. Next slide, please, Tom. The website really kicked off, and following thousands of testimonies on the website, Ofsted carried out an emergency review of sexual abuse in schools and published a report on the 10th of June this year. As part of the emergency review, 32 schools were visited and 900 children and young people were spoken with to create the report. The report really highlights how prevalent sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online sexual abuse, is for children and young people. One of the areas of specific concern, particularly for us, is that Ofsted has found that senior school leaders are often unclear on what falls on schools to refer and investigate, noting that schools have a duty to refer concerns about children to statutory agencies, irrespective of where they occur. Some leaders didn't identify sexual harassment as problematic, dismissing it as banter, mucking around, or were completely unaware it was happening and underestimated the prevalence, particularly of online sexual abuse. Following the emergency review, Ofsted has stated that schools, colleges, and multi-agency partners should act as though sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are happening, even where there are no specific reports being made. Preventing sexual harassment and sexual violence should be a key strategic priority for schools, not only because of the harmful impact that it has on young people, but because of time, energy, and costs that are absorbed in dealing with complaints. Ofsted recommends focusing on having clear policies in place and implementing sanctions where appropriate. Next slide, please, Tom. In terms of the current guidance which you should be following, some of the guidance which has been published by the Department for Education includes Keeping Children Safe in Education 2021, and it's key that you're following the most up-to-date version of this guidance, which was published in September. Sexual violence and sexual harassment between children in schools, sharing nudes and semi-nudes advice, and searching, screening, and confiscation advice. Next slide, please, Tom. Moving on to look at peer-on-peer abuse in particular. When Keeping Children Safe in Education was updated in September this year, a new focus on peer-on-peer abuse was introduced. All staff must be aware that peer-on-peer abuse can happen both inside and outside of the school premises, and it can also happen online. Staff must therefore be prepared to recognise the signs of peer-on-peer abuse and know how to identify it and respond to a report. Peer-on-peer abuse is likely to include bullying, including cyberbullying, abuse in personal relationships between peers, physical abuse such as hitting and kicking, which can include an online element, sexual violence and sexual assault, which again can include an online element, sexual harassment such as comments, remarks, jokes, and again online sexual harassment, causing someone to engage in sexual activity without consent, consensual and non-consensual sharing of images and videos, upskirting, and initiation or hazing type violence, which can include harassment, abuse, or humiliation as part of initiating a person into a group, and again can include an online element. So one of the key takeaways from this is that these examples of peer-on-peer abuse can include online elements. So you need to be aware of not only what is happening physically in the school premises, but what is happening online. Next slide, please, Tom. As previously mentioned, the Everyone's Invited website has highlighted just how prevalent peer-on-peer abuse is, both inside and outside of the educational setting. The fact that no reports have been made does not mean that peer-on-peer abuse is not happening in your school. It may just be that issues are not being reported. It's important, therefore, that if a member of staff has any concerns, they speak to their designated safeguarding lead or deputy. To avoid creating an unsafe environment in your school, it's never acceptable to downplay certain behaviours, such as dismissing sexual harassment as banter, having a laugh, part of growing up, or in some cases, boys being boys. Having a robust child protection policy is key, and you should ensure that it includes procedures to minimise the risk of peer-on-peer abuse, the systems in place for children to confidently report abuse, knowing that their concerns will be treated seriously, how allegations of peer-on-peer abuse will be recorded, investigated, and dealt with, and clear processes as to how victims, perpetrators, and any other children affected by peer-on-peer abuse will be supported by the school. Next slide, please, Tom. Whilst tackling peer-on-peer abuse is clearly a priority, it should not be forgotten that allegations may also be made against staff at your school. The school should have in place its own procedures for dealing with concerns or allegations made against anyone working in or on behalf of your school, and that includes supply teachers, volunteers, and contractors. When Keeping Children Safe in Education was published in September, 2 levels of allegation or concern were introduced. The first is an allegation that may meet the harms threshold for referral to the local authority, and the second is an allegation or concern that does not meet that harms threshold and is known as a low-level concern. I'm going to look at each of these in turn and take you through some examples of them. Moving on to the next slide, please, Tom. Allegations that may meet the harms threshold are those which might indicate that a person would pose a risk of harm if they continue to work in their present position or indeed in any capacity with children in the school. This includes supply teachers, volunteers, and contractors, and includes behaviour where they have harmed a child or may have harmed a child, where they have possibly committed a criminal offence against or related to a child, where they have behaved towards a child in a way that indicates that they may pose a risk of harm to children, or they have behaved or may have behaved in a way that indicates that they may not be suitable to work with children. In respect of this final bullet point, where an individual has behaved or may have behaved in a way that indicates that they may not be suitable to work with children, it's key to remember that this may have happened outside of school, and this behaviour outside of school may make them inappropriate to work with children. If an allegation is made about a member of staff, including volunteers and contractors, posing a risk of harm to children, then it should be referred to the head teacher. In some circumstances, this may not be appropriate if the allegation is made against the head teacher, in which case it should be referred to the chair of governors. There may be a lack of appropriate resource in school, or there may be a particular nature or complexity to the allegation, in which case the allegation will likely require an independent investigator. Next slide, please, Tom. Moving on to low-level concerns, it's really important to remember that the term low-level does not mean that the concern is insignificant, but that the behaviour towards a child does not meet the harms threshold. A low-level concern is any concern, no matter how small it may seem, even if it just creates a sense of unease or a nagging doubt that an adult working in or on behalf of the school may have acted in a way that is inconsistent with the staff code of conduct, including inappropriate conduct outside of work, but the behaviour does not meet the allegations threshold or is otherwise not considered serious enough to consider a referral to the local authority. Some examples of behaviour which may amount to a low-level concern are being overly friendly with children, having favourites, taking photographs of children on the mobile phone, engaging with a child on a one-to-one basis in a secluded area or behind a closed door, or using inappropriate, sexualised, intimidating or offensive language with children. In terms of addressing these low-level concerns, as good practice, governing bodies should set out their low-level concerns policy within their staff code of conduct and the safeguarding policy. They should make it clear what a low-level concern is and the importance of sharing low-level concerns, again, even if it's just a nagging doubt or a sense of uneasiness. Policies should also set out how unprofessional behaviour will be addressed by the school. Next slide, please, Tom. When it comes to reporting sexual violence or sexual harassment, children may not always find it easy to tell a member of staff verbally about their abuse, and may instead try to show signs or act in ways that they hope adults will pick up on and act upon. If staff have any concerns about a child's welfare, they should act on them immediately rather than waiting for that verbal prompt from the child. When responding to a report, it's essential that all victims are reassured that they are being taken seriously and that they will be supported and kept safe, no matter how long it may have taken them to make the reports. Schools must ensure that the reporting procedures are adapted to make them easier to access where necessary for pupils with SEND. Unfortunately, it's been shown that these pupils with SEND are 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual violence or sexual harassment. So it's extremely important that they are able to access help. To ensure that reports are responded to appropriately, all staff should be trained to manage a report. Effective safeguarding practice includes, if possible, managing reports with 2 members of staff present and having one of these staff members be the designated safeguarding lead or deputy where that's possible. If the report includes an online element, you should be aware of the searching, screening and confiscation advice and the sharing news and semi-news advice for schools. The key consideration in these situations is not to view or forward illegal images of a child in any circumstance unless it's completely unavoidable. In some cases, it's probably more appropriate to confiscate devices and share them with the police instead. Your practice should also include not promising confidentiality at the initial stage because it's likely that other people will need to be involved. You should ensure that you listen carefully to the child, reflect back to them using their own language, and be non-judgmental. You should be clear about boundaries and how the report will be progressed and not ask leading questions. In terms of the practicalities of making the report, best practice is to wait until the end of the report and immediately write up a summary. This will allow you to listen to the child rather than focus on taking notes. However you do it, you must make sure that an accurate written record is made as soon as possible. You should only record the facts as the child presents them and avoid giving the note taker's point of view. And you should inform the designated safeguarding lead or deputy as soon as possible if they were not able to sit in on the initial report. Next slide, please, Tom. As Jonathan has mentioned, the designated safeguarding lead or deputy should make a risk and needs assessment considering the victim, perpetrator, and all other children, especially any actions that are appropriate to protect them from the alleged perpetrator or from further harm. Where there's been a report of sexual violence, the designated safeguarding lead or deputy should make an immediate risk and needs assessment. In the case of a report of sexual harassment, the need for a risk assessment should be considered on a case-by-case basis. Risk assessments should be recorded and kept under review, and where there's been a report of sexual violence, it's likely that professional risk assessments by social workers or sexual violence specialists will also be necessary. The designated safeguarding lead or deputy will likely have a complete safeguarding picture and will be the most appropriate person to advise on the school's initial response. Important considerations will include the wishes of the victim, the nature of the alleged incident, and any ongoing risks. Options will then include managing any support for the child internally, using the school's own pastoral support processes, undertaking an early help assessment, which I'll move on to later, Making a referral to children's social care, for example, as a child might be in need, suffering or likely to suffer harm, and making a report to the police, and that will be generally in parallel with a referral to children's social care. Where a report has been made to the police, the school should consult the police and agree what information can be disclosed to staff and others, in particular the alleged perpetrator and their parent or carers. The school should do all that it reasonably can to ensure anonymity of children involved and not disclose information without the agreement of the local authority and the police where they are involved. Next slide, please, Tom. So once a report has been made, you'll need to consider how to manage the needs of not only the victim, but also the alleged perpetrator. When a report is made, close proximity with the alleged perpetrator is likely to be especially distressing for the victim. Whilst the school establishes the facts of the case and starts the process of liaising with children's social care and the police where necessary, it may be reasonable to remove the alleged perpetrator from any classes they share with the victim, particularly where sexual violence has been reported. The school should also carefully consider how to keep the victim and alleged perpetrator a reasonable distance apart on transport to and from the school where appropriate. It's key to remember that these actions are in the best interests of all involved and should not be perceived to be a judgment of guilt in any way. Once a report has been made, it may unfortunately open up the victim to potential bullying for having made that report. And it's therefore important that the school does everything it can to protect the victim from bullying and harassment. As Emma's discussed earlier, a managed move off school may be necessary for the victim in order that they can carry on their education, whilst the school should give all necessary to support the victim to remain in school. The trauma may result in them being unable to do so. Alternatively, it may be that rather than pursuing a managed off-site schooling, mandatory off-site schooling may be a preferable option to ensure that the victim and alleged perpetrator have sufficient separation whilst investigations are conducted. It's also important that a perpetrator is given support to try to stop them reoffending and to address any underlying trauma that may be causing this behaviour. Perpetrators can oftentimes be victims of assault themselves, so it's important to help them to deal with any issues that they may be going through. Where a criminal investigation into sexual assault leads to a charge or caution, the school should consider any suitable sanctions, and that may include permanent exclusion. Next slide, please, Tom. So as mentioned, the school may decide that the children involved do not require referral to statutory services, but may instead benefit from early help. Early help means providing support as soon as a problem emerges at any point in a child's life. Providing early help can be more effective in promoting the welfare of children rather than reacting later after an incident has occurred, and it can be particularly useful to help to prevent escalation. Designated safeguarding leads and deputies should therefore know what early help is, what the process is, and how and where to access support. Any early help cases should be kept under constant review. If a child's situation does not appear to be improving or indeed gets worse, you should consider whether a referral to children's social care for assessment for statutory services would be suitable. Next slide, please, Tom. So in terms of practical steps that you can take to protect your school, you should prepare for Ofsted to focus on the school's approach to managing and responding to allegations of sexual violence or harassment. Following the June 2021 report, Ofsted will be honing in on steps that the school is taking to protect their students. You should also review your risk assessment to ensure that it is up to date and meets its purpose, and provide all members of staff at your school with appropriate training. This is to help them manage and respond appropriately to reports of sexual violence and sexual harassment, and also to be aware of the signs of abuse. They particularly need to be aware of signs of abuse to help those pupils who may find it difficult to let a member of staff know verbally that they are being abused. There are also steps which can be taken in respect of your policies, which includes ensuring that your school has an up-to-date policy on relationship and sex education. In primary schools, this is relationship education, which should follow consultation with parents and take into account the age and religious background of pupils. You should also ensure that your school has a robust child protection and safeguarding policy in place, which is up to date and compliant with Keeping Children Safe in Education 2021. If it's not been reviewed over the summer or since September, then it's likely to need updating. Your commercial contracts should also be reviewed, as they may need amending to include obligations in relation to external hirers. It must be clear who is responsible for safeguarding. For example, if an activity is school-led and school supervised, then the school's safeguarding policy will apply. If not, then the external agency's policy will apply. So you'll need to seek confirmation that they have an appropriate policy in place. Where relevant, you should make it a condition of use that a safeguarding policy is in place, and failure to comply with the safeguarding policy should result in termination. So that concludes my review of managing safeguarding in schools and managing allegations. I'm going to hand you over to Stephen Murray now, who is going to take you through protecting your school's reputation.
Thank you, Coral. Good morning, everybody. As Coral mentioned, I'm Stephen Murray. I'm here to talk to you this morning about reputation protection. This is going to be focusing on the steps you need to take to manage reputational risks, including those arising from the issues highlighted by Coral in her talk just now. The aim here is to give you a greater understanding of the risk factors and the tools that you need to successfully navigate the landscape to protect your reputation. But how can you best describe what reputation is? I had a look around for some quotes. I managed a place called a Reputation Institute. Apparently it is a thing over in the States. And a lady there called Melanie Lebu, a blogger, said that reputation is an emotional bond between an organization and its stakeholders. Reputational risk is now the #1 concern for organizations. A school's reputation will be by far its most valuable asset, more than the land and building it owns, because if you can't have established good reputation, why would anybody choose to come to your school? Tom, next slide, please. Benjamin Franklin also said that it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation, but it only takes one bad deed to lose it. Along a similar vein, in 2008, Warren Buffett said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. 13 years on, and that concept holds true. But with the explosion of social media, with 91% of us accessing it via mobile devices and spending an average of 3 hours per day on social media, relying on social media's influencers to follow their recommendations is becoming increasingly a factor that you have to bear in mind. Do any of our listeners this morning use TripAdvisor? Whether it be for a holiday or a restaurant? Would you consider going to a restaurant that just opened if it had no reviews? Or if you knew that no one had been or had a bad review, would you still consider going? If there'd been a positive review, you probably would be quite keen to. Or if a neighbour had said it was good, then you'd probably follow their recommendation. Say you had an exceptional service. Would you post a review about that experience? Or would you just think about it? Contrast with that where you've had an unpleasant experience, been incensed by the service that you received. How quickly are you to adopt the keyboard warrior mentality and express your displeasure online? And if you shop on Amazon, have you noticed that as soon as the delivery has occurred, you're being asked to review the product? This is also that company can build a good reputation in that online marketplace. I'm sure, like you check the reviews before you buy a product. If there was a negative one, I'd probably just walk away, or certainly wouldn't be given the product the benefit of the doubt if I could find one that had a good review. That all shows that whilst it may take less time than the 20 years to build the reputation Warren Buffett referred to these days, maybe only a month or two, it only takes one click to ruin it. Next slide, please. So I think this encapsulates really the world that we're living in at the moment, this slide. Without a website, you don't really exist. Without good listings on Google, no one will know that you exist. Once you've got a good reputation and you've got strong listings on Google and you've engineered your search engine optimization to get you the highest listings in your area for your particular school, you then have to still work damn hard to maintain it. You must own your reputation and actively pursue strategies to communicate who you are it to the broader stakeholder community, the current parents, pupils and staff. You have online prospectuses for parents and staff now, and you need to make sure that they send the same message and a consistent one that presents a positive image of your school. But it's not all about positive images, and there are many factors which can impact how your reputation develops over time. Tom, next slide, please. This slide shows all of the factors that impact on how a reputation develops and can be maintained. To manage reputational risks, you need to manage each of these factors. If the staff are happy, the children will be happy, and in turn, the school will develop a reputation as a happy school. Compliance with teaching and reporting standards will ensure the assessment proceeds well, and you can broadcast how well your school is doing academically. You get the idea. But if we look at it from the negative end of the spectrum, can you identify which of these factors is most likely to be the highest risk, most likely to cause the most damage if not monitored? If you've been thinking customer services, you'd be correct. Parents and pupils are your customers. Indeed, so are your staff. And whilst in this scenario, customers are not always likely to be right, if you don't manage them, manage their expectations, they will certainly let you know. And the world will know through the power of social media. Next slide, please. The cultural phenomenon of social media has forever changed the way in which we communicate. There are now 2.89 billion monthly active users on Facebook. I checked this morning as well, and it's 1.8 billion per day active across the world. As far as Instagram is concerned, that's 1 billion. 2 years ago, it was only 600 million. There's 2 billion active users of WhatsApp and 290 million Twitter users. It's surprising anybody gets time to do any work these days. Whilst the social media phenomenon gives you an opportunity to disseminate important information quickly, the faceless nature of the medium encourages many of those who use social media to vent and rant without fear of reprisal. You and your staff will most likely have at least one of these accounts, as will your students, depending on their age. But you can certainly guarantee their parents will be on social media. And I think, as was mentioned by Jonathan earlier, WhatsApp groups or other social media collectives can be set up for negative purposes. And it's true to say that schools, sadly, are becoming increasingly victims of malicious reviews and comments on social media forums. Even if your school doesn't have one of its own Facebook pages or a website forum, unhappy parents, disappointed pupils, or disgruntled staff will find a way to express their views on social media and raise their grievances that way. This could be by the website Rate My Teacher or Google My Business and the reviews that appear on there. The extent of any reputational damage caused will depend on the veracity of those comments, the size of the section of the public who see it, and how long it remains there. When faced with a derogatory review, it is important to react appropriately. Although perhaps not as serious as a fire or a flood, a damaging comment on social media can represent a crisis, especially for the reputation of the school or a member of staff. As such, it's imperative that your school has a policy detailing what steps will be taken and when. Throughout the rest of the session, I hope to identify some practical processes that you can adopt to minimize the impact of antisocial comments on social media. Tom, next slide, please. Now, the first part of this plan would be to train. Given the proliferation of social media, it's important to raise everyone's awareness of it and train your staff as to what your school's policy is on the use of social media. Do you allow staff to post comments? How do you think their comments reflect on the school as a whole? Do the personal opinions of the staff members align with the school's ethos? Is there a risk that too many posts from staff could give the impression that they are not devoting sufficient time to the day job? This is not about creating a police state. People should be free to express themselves, but you should educate your staff to bear in mind that they are ambassadors for the school and should therefore be mindful of how it might reflect on it. Encouraging a healthy approach to social media and a vigilance to protect the school's brand will increase the number of people watching out for negative comments. And if you educate them as to what steps need to be taken to address an issue once it's been identified, you'll have a better chance of maintaining that good reputation. Now, it's safe to say that when you've got a plan, it's always important to stick to it. Whether this talk prompts you to create a plan or simply update the one you have existing, you have to make sure that you stick to it when the worst happens. The first stage of that plan will need to establish the source of the comment and access the relevant information behind why that comment was made. That way you can understand what the individual is talking about and why they may feel the way that they've expressed themselves. If you're not the person responsible for this, it may be necessary to identify another member of staff who can be put in charge of responding to social media posts, or at least dealing with a negative comment once it arises. You want to make sure that they are comfortable with doing so, because you don't want to put extra pressure on somebody who's not going to have the best interest of the school at heart when they're concerned about their own position. Now, it might not always be necessary to consult a solicitor when the worst happens, but a quick call to us may help put your mind at ease. Next slide, please, Tom. The next stage of the plan is to have a monitoring policy. There are over 510,000 comments being posted on Facebook every minute. A comment can turn into a crisis quickly because one parent can like or retweet a negative comment made by one of the other members of the school family, and then their friends see it, and before you know it, the issue has snowballed. It's therefore important to manage the school's brand effectively and protect your staff's reputation. Systems should be adopted to monitor the comments being made, both on your own webpage and while you're afield. Now, you all install smoke detectors in key locations around your buildings so that in the event of a fire, you can escape unscathed. On screen are the digital equivalent of smoke detectors. You can choose to use all of them or none of them, but you must have some way of monitoring what is being said about you and your staff online, so that as soon as that issue is identified, you can react quickly and effectively to quell whatever that issue might be raising. I appreciate that setting aside time regularly to monitor comments will be difficult, but it is necessary, especially given the issue identified by Coral earlier. Bear in mind that most comments are made between 6 PM and 8 PM during the week, with more activity on Thursday and Friday. So if you plan your monitoring time for those to coincide with those, then you might be more effective use of your time, or the person responsible for monitoring. Now, the poster is looking to cause the maximum damage with a comment. They'll probably wait for the school holidays, post it on the Friday or the last day of term. More parents will be online during the day, and therefore there'll be a lack of staff monitoring as well. So having some sort of plan over the holidays to have somebody keep an eye on things is important. Now, it's possible to automate the monitoring. Google My Business will send notifications of a new review to the person who set up to administer that Google My Business page. Facebook will advise when a user profile has been used in a comment, or when a page you operate has had a new comment. It's therefore necessary to ensure the email that those notifications are sent to is monitored regularly, and then that person knows who they need to speak to if there's something that needs to be done quickly. Tom, next slide, please. Now, I regularly encourage my school clients to set up Google alerts like the one on screen. So this way, if you put in a search term such as your school's name, a teacher's name, then Google will notify you as soon as that search term is mentioned anywhere online. And so it's useful to identify things that are happening in the future, but without you having to constantly monitor it. But again, as I said, the notifications are going to be sent to one email address, and it's important that that person who is likely to receive those notifications is monitoring and keeping an eye out for it and knows what to do when they are received. Next slide, please, Tom. I'd say that the most important advice that I can give you this morning is not to react in anger. As tempting as it might be to respond immediately, pausing to assess the situation before acting is important. Until you can understand the reason the individual had for making the comment, replying may only make matters worse. Now, constructive feedback of the school and its policies and activities should be encouraged. And if those comments are not too inflammatory, you might be able to speak to the individual to discuss their concerns privately. because you have to bear in mind that if you do react or respond, everybody will see your response, even if you send something directly to the individual concerned privately. There's no stopping them reposting those comments online as part of the comments that they've made previously. Now, most of these comments are made because the person who's made them is seeking a reaction. Feeding that desire will only lead to further negative comments. Next slide, please. Once you've got a situation where there is something rather unpleasant online, you need to take steps to remove those truly offensive comments. Now, the easiest and most cost-efficient way of doing this is to be speaking to the individual. As mentioned previously, engaging with them in a positive way may lead to them seeking to remove the comment willingly. Now, if they're not willing to remove the post, depending on the media platform in question, you can take a couple of steps to try and remove it. On screen, or a few of the screens you'll see, or the windows that pop up when you seek to remove things on Facebook or Instagram. Now, as you can see, the Facebook, they have next to the comment section, a down arrow to the right of the header. Clicking on this provides a drop-down menu from which you can report the post. If the post offends Facebook's guidelines, are being sexually explicit, incites violence or hatred, Facebook will remove the post and any replies there too. Next slide, please, Tom. Google has a similar approach, and the team here were recently successful in removing a series of malicious posts by a person using pseudonyms. If you are the administrator of the forum or page which the comments appear on, then it ought to be not too difficult for you to remove any offending thread. However, don't be surprised if the commentator reverts to more public forums to express their displeasure. If you have a clear and accessible policy for your forum, you can refer the offending user to it and the reason for why you removed their comments, and hopefully generate a dialogue that resolves the issue privately and productively. As any legal process will inevitably be expensive, resorting to the law to remove a negative post should be a last resort. When you know the individual responsible for the post and their address, a strongly worded letter from a solicitor can have the desired effect. The takedown notice will identify the post concerned and explain the legal basis for what has been infringed, whether that be use of copyright materials, defamation of the teachers or staff, and then require the removal of the post within a set period of time. If that request is not adhered to willingly, then matters will need to be escalated. Where defamation is concerned, it's important to note that you must start court proceedings within 12 months of the post being made public. So it's not ideal to wait to the last minute to do that. And hopefully the 12 months prior to needing to do so, you can spend talking productively to the person involved. It's most likely there are going to be wider issues that the school is going to be engaged in any event, and hopefully those matters can be resolved in one go. Depending on the ease with which the individual can be identified, the school could consider initiating legal action against the platform or the internet service provider. I've written a letter to Google and Facebook saying that the contents of the posts are malicious, defamatory, and contain images which the poster has no license to use. As a result, both Facebook and Google remove the posts concerned. But if they're not willing to do so, then it is possible to go to court and get an injunction that requires the removal of access to certain web pages or websites. The action is not against the person responsible for the post, but the internet service provider, the ISP. The default position under EU law is that ISPs are not responsible for the content on their pages. They are merely conduits. However, once you give them notice that infringing acts have taken place on their platform, they lose the ability to defend their action of being simply a conduit. And it is possible to obtain a blocking order against the internet service provider, which prevents that web page from being accessed. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, where a comment or about a member of staff or pupil is particularly egregious and false, you can assist that person in having the web page containing those comments being removed from search results. In May 2014, the Courts of Justice of the European Union found that an individual can request search engines to remove specific results about them which appear to be inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant, or excessive in light of the time that's elapsed. The advent of GDPR also provides an enshrined right to be forgotten. Now, it's not an absolute right, and requests to be forgotten will need to be balanced against other rights, such as freedom of expression and the media. So if there are something that you can demonstrate is truly inaccurate, then exercising the right to be forgotten is a short and productive way of having that post removed. Now, not school related, but I recently had a matter involving a sports association which had inaccurate findings being posted on a news website. We relied on the GDPR right to have the information corrected and the right to be forgotten when that information was inaccurate. And on that basis, the offending reviews have been removed. Now, it will be necessary for the individual or someone on their behalf to fill in the online form. And that will need to be accompanied by digital identification and the search results specifically that you wish to be disassociated from and why. Now, I'm sure we can share later on the actual site for that, but it is possible to find the information online. But do ask the question later if you need to have that information. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, in summary, hopefully the last couple of minutes have provided you with an overview of the types of things you need to include in your plan already. And that is, firstly, to have a plan. You must train your staff, making sure that they're familiar with the developments and the changes that there may have been in the school's policy towards the use of WhatsApp, Facebook, or other social media sites. It's important to monitor what's going on online, who's saying what about your school and your members of staff. Acting quickly and effectively will hopefully minimize the damage that could be caused to both your school and those individuals' reputations. Don't react in anger. Make sure that you pause and try to understand what has motivated the comments in the first place. It may be that there is something that needs to change within the school and that the individual who made the post has tried to effect that change previously, but to no avail. Engaging with them on what changes that are appropriate to be made will help you encourage them to remove the negative posts. If they're not willing to do so, then come speak to myself or one of my colleagues about pursuing the removal of it through legal means. I think at this stage I'll be handing back to Emma, but I'll be around later for the question session. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Steve. I'm pleased to say now we have Hannah Woodhouse, who, as many of you will know, of course, is the Regional School Commissioner for the Southwest. Hannah, good, we can see you. Very, very good to have you here, and thank you very much for joining us. Hannah is going to be talking to you and giving just an overview of her role as the RSC. I know personally, I mean, there are some things obviously we're all very much aware of in terms of your role in looking at schools who are applying to become sponsors or going through the conversion process. I believe you're also very much involved, though, in approving significant changes that schools are applying for. And that is something that certainly we've seen increasingly over the past few years. And I have to say, a few schools who weren't perhaps fully aware of the process and when they should be making those applications. So there have been one or two that may have possibly come your way rather late in the day, but it's always good to have all of these matters that you deal with flagged up so everyone's very, very much aware about your role and what you do. But also, I know obviously in conversations with schools, everyone is very much interested in the government's agenda going forward, what you think in terms of the DfE's plans are for greater academisation and schools joining, forming, creating, merging maps. So I will hand over to you at this point. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Great, thank you. Now, I was really keen to join. Thanks very much for inviting me. So my name is Hannah Woodhouse, and I live in Monmouth, which is in South Wales, which I don't think is very far away from the schools that, sorry, let me just put this slide up, from the schools that you're working with. Hang on, sorry, I can't do two things at once, apologies.
That's right, Hannah. I'm personally based on Ross on Wye, so not very far away at all.
Fine. So can you see those slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, good. Yeah, so now I'm not far, and often spend some, enjoy going across the bridge and into Bristol or across the river into Gloucestershire. So it's very lovely to be working here. I was just going to talk a little bit about what we do. So I have been in this role for 2 years, and before that I started in the department in '99, and have been involved in sort of policy work, and I've also worked for a local authority and with local authorities in both England, Wales and New Zealand. But all around a theme of school improvement and collaboration, basically, for the last 20 years. And this role, it covers the southwest of England, as you know. So we run from Gloucestershire down to Swindon, down to Bournemouth, and across to Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. So it's a beautiful big region, 2,300 schools. There's a team of about 70 of us who are based in Bristol and in London and Exeter. So we cover the region, and we're very much the sort of front face of the Department for Education for schools nowadays. And there is some work going on around broadening the role to focus more around children's social care and SEN, and possibly with the ESFA as well. So as all organisations, we are always in flux, but at the moment our role is threefold. We cover academies, as you say. So we have about 160 multi-academy trusts, the same number of single academy trusts. A third of the single academy trusts are in Gloucestershire. So we've got a big agenda around MAT growth, making decisions about which trusts grow when, taking on more schools. We also have an oversight role around trusts, so making sure trusts are showing improvement, are constructed in a way legally and in governance terms that is compliant and about driving improvement. We do intervene. So where schools are judged inadequate, we issue a termination warning notice and generally remove the school from the trust. And as you know, the same is true of maintained schools. If they are judged inadequate, then there's a directive academy order issued. So we do a lot of sort of growth intervention transfer work, and that's the sort of biggest bit of our work. It's the traditional bit that the RSE always has done, and continues to this day. We are the most academised region in the southwest. About 2/3 of children in this region are in academies. And so we have got a big agenda around how do we make sure that academies are driving really great outcomes, and working really well with local schools, local community schools, as well as local authorities. So it's a lively patch at the moment. We also have a role around free schools and places planning. And as you say, that's where the SIG changes come in. So our job is to support local authorities to make sure that there are enough places in every place, which includes deciding where new schools go. As you know, all new schools are called free schools, and it's our job to decide when it goes up, for how many children, where, and who runs it, and working with the local authority and with the capital teams there. We also look at a lot of schools, as you say, expanding at the moment. That's partly due to a pressure on places coming through into the secondary. It's about sort of year 7 and 8 at the moment. So how can we expand schools where we haven't got enough new schools, and particularly supporting local authorities in capital. They provide the capital, we agree the school. That is the process. So just to be really clear, your point, yes, if you are going to expand by more than 30 in terms of your PAN, you do need to ask us to approve a significant change if you are an academy trust or an academy. So, and often it is the case that schools don't realise that and therefore come to it late, and where frankly we have little choice often but to say yes, but it's not great, and it means that the trust is at risk of running outside of its funding agreement. So if you're going to expand, please talk to us early is basically the message, including for resource bases for SEN places as well, which is also very, very lively agenda at the moment. And then our last role is around school improvement, which is a broad bucket of things. In this context, we mean support for vulnerable schools, any vulnerable schools, but particularly those who have been judged requires improvement by Ofsted, or have leadership or governance breakdown, or vulnerable for a number of different reasons. So there is some support which we can provide or broker from other schools, either at leadership or governance level. We work with the teaching school hubs, of which there are 2 in Gloucestershire, to provide support for recruitment and retention, which is, I think, the number1 issue across this region and the country at the moment. And how can we, particularly in this workforce and this market, workforce market, attract particularly teaching assistants and lunchtime supervisors to school. So there's a big agenda around recruitment and retention as well. And then obviously, at the moment, we're doing a lot of work around COVID, support for schools, working with local authorities, public health teams, around public, practical measures, all of that work, which is taking a lot of our time. Now, I don't want to say a lot more. Probably just be good just to take any questions. Just on the sort of agenda around trust and the future. I mean, we know a white paper is coming out in the spring, and we've also got the SEND review, long awaited, at the same time. And I think, my hope is, and I've been a bit involved in the policy development, is that it will set out a bit more of a shape of the sector for the next 10 years. Ministers have been clear they do want to go towards full or fuller academisation, and therefore what is the role of the local authority, which is as important as ever before, particularly around vulnerable children and sufficiency and safeguarding. What is the support for maintained schools and single academy trusts as we encourage them to support MATs or to grow MATs as multi-academy trusts? What is the position around inclusion in particular, and how can trusts, academies, local authorities work together across a place? So that's what I think will be clearer, I hope, in the policy set out in the spring. And as we know, there's a bill likely to follow that as well. So it's unusual, I think, to have the spending review, the money, new ministers, a white paper and legislation at the same time. So I think it gives an opportunity to sort of bring a coherence, perhaps that we might not have had for some years, because we haven't had all of those 4 things at the same time. We have seen throughout the pandemic that schools have had to lead. Amazingly, we have seen that isolated, vulnerable schools have been hit hardest. So there is, I think, more of a push to make sure that every school is supported. We're using this language around families of schools, partnerships of schools, making sure every school is part of a partnership. So, and particularly spotting schools that are vulnerable. Part of our job is to encourage schools to join trusts for that reason. And I always say that when asked the question, why should I join a trust? It is about leadership development. It is about support for your teachers, for your leaders, providing broader opportunities to work across a number of schools, to share practice, and to think of the trust as the organisation really of which the schools are part. And that is, I believe, founded in good evidence and research around what works in school improvement is strong collaborations. So we are having lots of conversations at the moment with maintained schools in particular about would you want to join a MAT? Is there a case for developing new trusts in your area? What would your children benefit from? What would your staff, yourself as leaders and governors? And we need good schools to join trusts because we have a lot of vulnerability in the region. And so the next slide just talks a little bit more about that increased capacity. I can send you these slides, Emma, sorry. Increasing capacity for school improvement is very much our focus in developing good MATs, career opportunities. There is a function around centralised teams, particularly finance, administration, estates, HR teams. There is an economy of scale, although to be honest, you know, you don't see much of that, certainly in the early years. But you know, and therefore able to release funds back into staffing, which is obviously hugely important all the time, and particularly at the moment. And we particularly want to encourage trusts to support new schools and vulnerable schools. So just quick process for joining a MAT. There's a legal process which you'll know. I think the first thing is to talk to the trust. The trustees and your own governing body need to make that decision about which trust you join. If you're a diocesan school, the diocese need to support that as well. Then you apply to us. I generally support it if it's got that far, because you know, the trust will be talking to us from the start of this process. The only reason we don't support applications is either because it looks like a group of schools that are all very good and not necessarily able or open to support more vulnerable schools. So sometimes we'd say, you know, where's the system leadership, where's the system contribution of these good schools working together? Or conversely, schools that have not shown over time, have been hit by a number of different things and therefore don't show the capacity to improve together. So lots of schools that may not have good judgments, for example, or above average outcomes coming together in a trust. It's the sort of thing we'd say, well, you know, is there enough capacity to improve schools together? So those tend to be the two reasons why we would just say, you know, can you encourage others to join you? And then there's the legal transfer, which takes about 3 or 4 months, as you'll know, Emma, it's good to line that up with the start of a school term so that the transfer takes place at the beginning of a school term, although it can take place any month of the year. Now that's a massively rapid run through. I've got the team leader here for Gloucestershire, because I know a number of your colleagues, clients are in Gloucestershire, but it may be broader than that. So I'll stop there.
That's splendid, and I'm sure that would have been a very helpful overview for everyone, Hannah. If you'd be kind enough, we've just got a couple of questions that have come in. Probably to kickstart, I hope this is certainly going to be the easiest one for you. How should a school go about contacting you to request a visit?
Yes, so really happy to do that. As I say, we're not far away. Joanne Hampton here. If you're in Gloucestershire, Jo lives in Stroud. I live in Monmouth, so really happy to come over. We always prefer to talk to people face to face, but do, you know, email us. It's very easy to do these virtual conversations now, isn't it? So come through Jo, or we are all on rsc.southwest@education.gov.uk. So that's our contact details.
Thanks, Hannah. The second question that's come in for you is, what do you actually hope to see and expect to see in the spring paper next year? Is there anything critical that you think is coming up? I think that's asking for a heads up.
Well, you know, and obviously a bit of this is politics. So, you know, who knows, because we have seen that swing around a bit under a Conservative government in the last 10 years. We've had different approaches from the same government. I suppose, you know, I've worked in local authorities, I've worked in the DfE office, I've worked with Academy Trust, I've worked with maintained schools. I suppose I would like to see a clear plan for a coherent system where schools are not left out. And we are operating, for reasons we all understand, a dual system. We're operating a system where you've got a local authority providing support to some schools, you've got a multi-academy trust providing support to some schools. That's expensive. It's not always great for communities, and it's not, you know, and I have a number of schools who desperately need the capacity of support from strong schools, and we're not able to draw on really good, particularly good maintained and good single academy trusts. And you know, my argument to those schools is, if you have really great teachers and leaders in your school, what is your plan for keeping them and extending their professional development if they've been there some time? I think joining a trust, and we've seen a lot of this from SATs and maintained schools have joined MATs, joining a trust is the best way to keep your greatest teachers and leaders and give them more professional development opportunities. Sorry, that turned into a bit of a sales pitch. I didn't mean that. But so I think I'm looking for, I'd love there to be a clear, coherent plan, which is what I think the sector is asking for as well. But I also think we should recognise that, you know, we're in really tumultuous times at the moment. This crisis, particularly, you know, we're potentially looking at a new variant now. We have to be careful that we're working together and not enforcing too much change. So I think a coherent plan over a sensible time frame would be what I'm looking for. I don't know if that's what we'll get, but that's what I'm asking for.
That's good to know. We won't blame you for what comes out in the spring. And one further question, Hannah. We've been asked why the grant for conversions hasn't increased over the years. It's stayed £25,000. I think that's what it was originally. This is particularly in light of the fact that some local authorities are now, of course, also seeking to charge their own costs for going through the conversion process. With a number of schools, certainly, that we work with, we've seen, particularly obviously with Church of England schools, they may have to take on board costs from the diocese. And also, I think I'd probably just add, sorry, I'm just expanding on this question, but the other concerns we've seen is where you've got single academies who are then joining a trust and aren't entitled to access a grant, unless you can kind of say, oh, there's, you know, the trust capacity grant, or it, you know, something else can be created. But your thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Yeah. It's a really good question. So I think on the overall conversion charge, it is a bit frustrating that different authorities do also charge different things. What we don't want to be doing is sort of pumping money into the system, which is therefore beefing up the sort of the capacity of local authorities. We want to make sure that the funding is used for proper purposes, I suppose. And so I do think this comes back to looking at the unit cost. What does it cost to convert a school in legal terms, in legal fees? And I think there is a bit of a sort of scale issue, because I think as we move towards a fuller academised system, there is something about if you're doing a lot of these, really, does it cost the same each time? So I think there is a bit of a question about you know, what the costs are and what they should be. But there's also a bit of a market being played, as you say, particularly by some authorities, but also by dioceses. I don't think it is the case, and I'd really like to see the detail of it if I'm wrong, that the combined cost of legal fees for a conversion does cost more than £25,000. Please tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that is the case. So I think we can increase.
I haven't seen that. Perhaps the question was alluding to some other costs, perhaps if they were changing finance systems or something. I don't
exactly. Yeah. Which you say is for TCAF, really.
Yeah.
I do think the stats thing is a good point. And actually talk to us, because I think we can make exceptional. We have paid for transfer costs for SATs recently. So we can make exceptions to that, particularly if the single academy trust is either vulnerable itself. So we're making a case for, well, surely it's better to do this and wait until they, you know, get into trouble, which will cost everyone more. Or particularly if they are a strong SAT joining a trust that really needs them. So we may be able to make a case for that. But I think in the policy work, it's true that in the policy work, as we're thinking about a fuller system, it's obviously one of the things that needs to go in the pot. And is being debated within a very tight spending review settlement. So, yeah, it is an issue because it does cost to move from a SAT to a MAT, and those costs are provided at the moment generally.
That's been brilliant. That's been really helpful. Thank you, Hannah. I think if I could ask the rest of the speakers today to come online, we have a few questions that have come in, I think, for other members of the panel.